Okay. All right. So this is a sort of a new approach that we've started taking, trying to give people virtual tours of our facility. We do a lot of real life tours. So if you're ever in this part of the country on the flip side of the coast, you can come by and see. But before anything, I tend to have to explain what the Leadership Computing Facility is. I guess I should introduce myself first. I'm Bronson Messer. I'm the Director of Science for the Oak Ridge Leadership Computing Facility, which is at Oak Ridge National Laboratory, unsurprisingly. National laboratories are interesting entities. To sort of like first approximation, they're just big collections of user facilities. And it's sort of everything that goes along with that. And we're no exception. We're a user facility that's used by in fact, scientists all over the world for lots of different things. Our mission specifically is to deploy and operate resources that are required to tackle big global challenges. And that includes resources to investigate systems at every scale, things you can't otherwise access, things like galaxy formation, other stellar astrophysics, Earth systems like climate, all the way down to automobiles and nanomaterials. And with the partnerships that we form with individual projects, we really try to push back the frontiers of science, not to make too much of a pun, in a lot of different ways. And it's actually it's a note that I'll hit later in the talk as well. What I think makes our facility different than other facilities like particle accelerators or light sources that people use. Another big user facility at Oak Ridge is the spallation neutron source, which has a really wide purview. It can do a lot of different kinds of science, from biology to material science to even macroscopic sort of cracking things for cement. But nothing has our sort of universal view of science. There is essentially no field of modern science that cannot be impacted directly by very, very high-end computing resources. And that makes us sort of special in that sense. Part of doing that is we tend to field some of the world's very largest and most powerful computers. And right now we have the world's most powerful computer, Frontier. It's a big machine. It's a big machine in almost every dimension that you want to measure it. It has 9,408 individual compute nodes. Those are distributed among 74 compute racks. And we'll sort of get a feeling of scale in a second when I show you more pictures of the data center itself. But this is something that I don't think people easily understand or can easily imagine. Each one of the compute racks, which is sort of one set of double doors in this picture that you see on this slide, they're 8,000 pounds apiece. And so in East Tennessee units, that's 2 F-150 pickups. So it's like having 2 large pickup trucks sitting on a piece of floor that's about the size of a commercial refrigerator, to give you some sense of scale. They're huge and they're really heavy, and we'll get to why they're really heavy in a second. There's 128 nodes in each rack. Each one of those compute nodes has a CPU, and attached to it are 4 AMD built GPUs. Each one of those GPUs actually looks to the user like it has 2 GPUs on it, so there's kind of 8, but there's 4 formally. This sort of hybrid between CPU and GPU computing is something that we've done for over a decade now. Well, we pioneered this at the high end for supercomputers back in 2012 when we launched Titan, and we've sort of gone along this ever since. And one of the main reasons, and I'll get to this in a second too, is GPUs are really, really fast and they're really, really energy efficient. Now, there's no free lunch. If you have something really, really fast and really energy efficient, you have to give up something. So I like to say that they're awesome, except they're abysmally stupid. You have to tell them to do the same thing over and over and over and over again. And the second you tell them to make a decision, they kind of freak out and they don't perform so well. So you write code, you write programs to run on them that sort of keep them nice and happy, just doing the same task over and over again, sort of like a threshing machine in a field of wheat or something like that, and just let them chew through the computations they need to chew through. That's not quite as easy as I've made it sound, but it is getting much easier as time goes by. What makes this supercomputer super, beyond just this having a ton of these GPUs and CPUs, is the interconnect. It's the network that connects the individual nodes to one another and lets them talk to each other with high bandwidth and with low latency. From the time I sort of decide I want to send a message to another node until I actually start getting it out on the wire is low on this slingshot network that's built by Hewlett Packard Enterprise, HPE, and their Cray sort of sub company. Attached to this machine is 700 petabytes of high performance storage. So basically just a bunch of spinning disk. There in front of that, there's 11 petabytes of flash storage. So, everybody's seen a USB key that you carry around to trade stuff with your friends with. We have 11 petabytes of that in front of that. And you get almost 10 terabytes a second of bandwidth from that. People use various programming models to write code and run code on the machine. I've listed some random names here. If anybody knows them, great, we can talk about that in a second. And each node has a maximum performance of 214 teraflops in double precision. So one thing I always have to stop and explain is, what do we mean by these numbers, exaflop, teraflop, whatever. So I'm assuming that most people know about metric prefixes. So, giga is a billion, tera is 10 to the 12, peta is 10 to the 15, exa is 10 to the 18. So the peak speed for Frontier is 2 exa flops. But what's a flop? A flop is a floating point operation per second. So take a number with a decimal point in it, another number with a decimal point in it, add or multiply them together and get the result out. We sort of, if you're really fast at math, we sort of run at a flop. We can sort of do one of those operations of order in a second, right? If you went to Best Buy and bought a brand new laptop, it would probably run at about 3 or 4 gigaflops. So it would be able to do 3 or 4 billion operations like that per second. Frontier running full out, that's peak speed is 2 exaflops. So again, 10 to the 18 of those operations per second. And we've actually measured it on a benchmark that tells us how much of that peak we can actually achieve, of almost 1.2 exaflops, which is actually really good nowadays for efficiency. So I'll take a quick stop there before I dive into some of the cool pictures and ask if anybody has an immediate question.
I have one, if you can hear me.
By all means.
My question was, how do you find the right balance of how many CPUs versus GPUs?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And that was a question that was like really front of our mind back in 2012 when we did Titan. It was like, should we have some nodes that just have CPUs on them? Should we have some nodes that have 2 GPUs and instead of 1? What should we do? That calculus for us nowadays is actually way, way, way easier because GPUs are so much faster than CPUs. We basically just put enough CPUs into the machine to act as orchestrators and nothing else. We assume that nobody is going to actually be using the CPU to do any of the heavy lifting with respect to crunching the numbers, because to do so, you'd take a 10x plus hit in speed and a 10x plus hit in energy efficiency. So we're assuming and most of our users have done this because they see this value proposition. Move all your computation to the GPU. Even if it takes you a little bit of time to work on the code, so be it. They have so much more computing power than the CPUs that it's not it's not a pressing problem anymore. We basically try to load the things up with as many GPUs as we can. So it's a great question, though.
Very cool. Thank you.
No, yes, you can say it.
Um, so when you're testing the computer, how
Mhm.
long does it take to run the different tests?
Ah, that's a really good question. So it depends on the tests. We have various phases of testing. We have a set of performance tests. We want to make sure that the machine is going to run fast as we think as fast as it should. That takes about a week because we don't just run a code once. We run several codes many, many times, and we get a statistical sort of breakdown of how fast they run. So that takes about a week. Then we run a stability test because we want to make sure the machine can stay up for a while and most of the nodes stay lit. We typically do that for upwards of a week. We basically need the machine, some percentage of the machine to stay up for all of a week. And the reason we do that is when we turn the machine on and turn it over to users, they run 24 hours a day, 365 days a year, full out the whole time. So we need to have that sort of duty cycle on the machine to be able to service all the work we need to do. So testing can take a while. This LINPACK benchmark that I just talked about, that you see referred to on the slide here, the bigger the supercomputer, the bigger the problem you need to do for that benchmark, because it scales with memory. And the bigger the problem you do, the more time it's going to take. So our LINPACK run took about 4 or 5 hours. And it started in the middle of the night and got finished in the early morning one day. So it was sort of inconvenient for the guys running it, but that them's the breaks, as they say. But testing overall takes, from the very, very start to the very, very finish can take several months. And that's certainly what we experienced.
And just a real quick follow-up to that.
Mhm.
So when you are like trying to procure a system from like Packard in this case, did you have multiple like cycles of running tests, optimizing the system, and then having the developer like rework some things to get to the specs that you're anticipating?
Yeah.
Or
Constantly. Yeah. That iterative process happens all the time. That's actually a really good way to put it. Invariably, because we are often, because we're the leadership computing facility for the nation, and indeed the world at this point, we are always at the very cutting edge of whatever the vendor is providing. And I have no qualms in telling you that every time we put a machine on the floor, there's a lot of stuff broken right out of the box, because it's never been built at that scale before we set it in our data center. We expect it. I think we would be highly suspicious if it weren't the case. And so that sort of iterative refinement of what we do is part and parcel of, and that's part of why the testing can take months. We find bugs, we fix them, we optimize, we go back and run the test again. We see something else, we fix it, we do it again. Until we sort of slow down the rate at which we're making improvements. But then they'll continue for the life of the machine. We intend to run this machine for 5 years. That kind of stuff will happen, and maybe people will realize another boost in performance at some point in the future because there's been a software fix. But we think we've beaten out most of the big performance bugs at this point.
thank you.
These are all terrific questions. Okay, so I'll press on and show some pretty pictures, and maybe we can come back to questions in a second. This is sort of a schematic of what the machine room actually looks like. It's about a half an acre in size. You can see over here on the right, I don't think you guys can see my pointer, but do I have a way to do that? Let's see.
We can see the pointer.
We can? Okay, great. So this is the machine itself. And, there's some pillars that have to be navigated around the machine itself. There's 74 total cabinets here, and they're big, like I said before. This side of the room is the storage. So again, this is almost 700 petabytes of storage. It looks like one big disk drive when you're setting on Frontier and you want to write to it. So it's pretty convenient that way. And then we have ancillary machines that we actually also mount that file system on. So we have a machine that we like to use, especially for visualization. It mounts that same file system, so you don't have to move the data back and forth. You can do it in place. You write it from the big machine and then pick it up with the visualization cluster. This room here is where the operators sit. So there's somebody who has a window out to the room 24 hours a day, who's sort of watching and just physically making sure that the machine's okay. Then there's other attendant pieces like transformers, electrical distribution units. It's pretty gnarly, and maybe we'll see some of that here in the virtual tour. I'm hoping we will anyway. So this is what it looks like when you walk up to our center, and maybe if I go back, it would be this area right here in the schematic. We have this observation deck that we let people look in on the machine for. You climb up. You can see here our certificates from the top 500 organization for having the world's fastest supercomputers at various times. Otherwise, though, this building and everything around it just looks like a regular old suburban office building or a newer academic building, right? It looks a lot like that. In truth, it's a bit of a steampunk monstrosity with all the violence that we've done to the building to try to get all the power that we need into the building and all the cooling, the attendant cooling with it as well. So if you were to come take a tour at Oak Ridge, you'd walk up on this little platform and look out over Frontier and see it in sort of all its glory from there. And this is sort of what it would look like when the windows were uncovered and you looked in. You'd be able to see that first row of cabinets. And over here on the far left, the storage itself, power distribution units over here. There's a lot of water moving under the floor. And the reason there's a lot of water moving under the floor is if we go in to the data center itself, I don't know if have people been to big computing data centers before?
I have.
Yeah, so if you had to pick a couple of adjectives to describe what they're like, what might you say?
Surprisingly, like, uncluttered. It's very, everything is hidden away.
That's good. Yeah. And then that we certainly have that because this is a 36-inch raised floor. So it's 3 feet off the actual ground. So there's stuff happening under here that we'll get to in a second. The other thing that people sometimes say is they're cold and they're loud, right? And that's true. Our data center is surprisingly quiet and not so cold. It's not, it's cool, but it's not cold. And the reason is every one of the components in Frontier is liquid cooled with water moving directly over the components. So if we look at one of the node boards here, you can actually see some of that plumbing. So these black things here in the front, those are the GPUs. Underneath this printed circuit board here in the back is the CPU, and you can actually see some banks of memory also attached to the CPU here. Here in the middle is a crossbar that goes out to the network, and this whole drawer here sort of slides into those racks, and there's 2 nodes on each drawer. Here's a little bit of a closer look, and you can see that this plumbing is pervasive throughout the node board. It's all over the place, and that's because the GPUs are liquid cooled, the CPUs are liquid cooled, the memory is liquid cooled, the network interface cards are liquid cooled. It's a remarkable number of things that are not air cooled. There's no cold air being pushed over any of these components to actually cool them. And what that means is we're sort of moving 6,000 gallons of water through the machine every minute, which is a ridiculous amount of water to be moved in. And the only way to do that is to have big 3-foot water pipes under the floor there to be able to move that much water. It's also one of the reasons the cabinets are so heavy. They're at any given point, they're holding a lot of water. Another interesting thing about that water is it's hot. It's like 90 degrees Fahrenheit. when it comes in to cool. But it gets heated to about 120 degrees Fahrenheit by the time it gets washed over these hot components. All that really matters thermodynamically is what the delta is between the hot and the cold side. So we get about 30 degrees Fahrenheit difference. That's what really tells us how much energy we're taking away, how much heat energy that we're getting out of the cabinets at any one time. Because we don't have to chill that water, cool it down farther, and make it really, really cold, that's a huge power savings for us. And somebody is asking, how much power does it actually take? So for that LIMPAC benchmark and for several other codes that we've seen, the load measured at those power distribution units is 29 megawatts. So if you've ever seen a electrical substation, they tend to have a bunch of transformers and, they're hooked up to the high tension wires and everything. And they sort of they're on a scale like a half an acre in size or an acre in size. They usually have about 25 megawatts of power coming out of them. So we need more than one whole one of those. So we use as much power as the rest of the laboratory combined plus a little bit. So it is a ridiculous amount of power. And so that's why we're so sort of obsessive about making sure that it's energy efficient as possible, including right down to using warm water cooling so we don't have to chill more water and waste more energy just to get the heat out of the room. But that's a really good question. This is what the cabinets look like. We don't pay extra to get the artwork, but they throw that in for free. But we did get to draw it ourselves. So that was nice. Here's what one of the fronts of the cabinets look like. The red hoses are where the hot water's coming out, and the blue hoses, you can guess, right? That's where the cooler but not cold water is coming in to wash over those individual node boards, an example of which you saw earlier. These nice chromed metal hoses and flanges up here. That's what's moving the bulk of the water through the cabinet at any one time. And then some of these other things are network connections to the network. Here you get a better view of what the machine looks like. You can see that there's some cables that are going over the top and out. And that's to allow connectivity to this set of discs that are over here on the left in this picture. We have a tradition at Oak Ridge that we use our machines as autograph books for visiting dignitaries. And so these are various people who were here, our former lab director, the CEO of AMD, our former immediate boss at DOE, the head of the Advanced Scientific Computing Research Arm, the head of the Office of Science, and a couple of other people have signed the machine because they've taken a tour. This is what it looks like if you're sort of looking at the machine from one of the rows in the storage system. And you can maybe it gives you a sense of how big it is. It's big. It's not ginormous compared to some other supercomputers that we've had in this room in the past, as far as sort of how big it is in the X and Y directions, but it's taller than a lot of machines we've had in here. Each one, like I said, each one of these cabinets, rather than being sort of the height of a residential refrigerator, is sort of the height of one of those industrial refrigerators that you see in a restaurant. And so it does make it a little bit darker in this room than what we're used to. This is what it looks like on the back of one of those rows. You can actually have access to both sides of the cabinet, and you need it in a lot of cases because you need to be able to get to power distribution, cooling distribution, other things like that. This is what the cabling looks like coming out of the back of each one of the nodes. Some of these are control network to be able to measure the health of each one of the nodes. Those cyan or turquoise cables are direct connections to that storage that's over on the other side of the room, and then everything else hooking all the nodes together. This is what the storage looks like over on this side of the room. And if you were in this part of the room, you would call me a liar about it being quiet. So the storage system is not liquid cooled. It's still air cooled. So on this side of the room, when you walk over towards the disk drives, things get loud again. And if you walk between the rows, some of the rows are cool, cold, air-conditioned air, and some of them are hot because they're basically the exhaust from the storage system. This is what they look like. Each one of these little boxes that you see behind this Faraday cage is an individual disk drive, and they're regular old SATA disk drives like you have in your home desktop machine. There's just there's a lot of them, well over 700 petabytes of raw capacity. It gets down to 700 petabytes of formatted capacity. And this is what the power distribution units look like on the back of those things as well. There's a lot of infrastructure that's sort of around the outside of the machine room. These high temperature water pumps. This is how we pump the cold water in. Remember, it's not cold, it's actually hot. That's why it's called high temp. And we have to have a water filter. We have to have a big filter for that as well, because it turns out that stuff likes to grow in warm water. I think everybody knows that, right? And so even though we're moving it through at high rates, we have to be careful about not letting stuff grow in there. Heat exchangers to get rid of that surplus heat, strainers for the water that we're going to put through the machine when it comes from the cooling towers that are outside. Water to pump the hot water back up to the top of these cooling towers that are on the roof of our building. And these just use evaporative cooling. So they just let the water cascade on a bunch of fins and expose it to air and cool it that way. There's no active cooling like a chiller would have. Okay, so that's sort of what the machine looks like. So before I go to the next little part that I wanted to talk about, I'll ask if there's any more infrastructure questions that have been prompted by anything I've said.
Where does the water for the lab come from?
Yeah, that's a good question too. We are in the middle of TVA country, so we have lots of lake impoundments behind dams. So a lot of that water we pump from various sources, including the lake. We're a little bit far away. We are evaporating some of the water, so we have to catch up water-wise a fair amount every day. But we have water all around us, which is a little bit different than some of the Western labs, right? They're in the middle of the desert, Los Alamos, even Sandia, even Livermore is on sort of the dry side of the Bay Area. We have an abundance of water around here.
Not quite a question, but a comment from when I toured a computing facility. We got to walk through the water pump area as well, and the whole water filtration system.
Yep.
That is also a noisy area, and you get to experience almost the entire room is like pressurized almost with air. It's a crazy experience to walk through and just kind of feel like you're being pushed on constantly.
Yeah, it's true, and there's a rhythmic sort of pulse too to those pumps that can lull you into. Well, I don't know if sleep is the right expression, but yeah, it definitely is sort of a different feeling. I agree. Yeah, it is. You're right. It is noisy. These are quiet outside, but this pump room, it's noisy there because you're basically using mechanical pumps to get that water back up and out of the facility. Okay, so a question that people often have is, what do you use? This is great, but what do you actually use this computer for? And one of the ways that's been posed to me in the past is there a killer app for exascale computing? And to be honest, I hate this question. For reasons that I've already sort of alluded to. The value of having the biggest supercomputer in the world is the ability to impact a huge variety of scientific problems. But that doesn't matter. People still ask it. So I've actually come to embrace an answer that maybe I would give them. And that is, there may not be a killer app, but there is this one ubiquitous physical problem that seems to impact a lot of different things, that requires a lot of memory, really fast compute speeds. And we have to account for it whenever you do a big multi-physics simulation, a simulation of a system that's complicated, has a lot of stuff going on, and that you have to keep track of because it all matters. And that particular physical problem is turbulence. So it's been called, turbulence has been called the last great unsolved problem in classical physics. There's this apocryphal tale, which I'm sure is not true, but it makes a pithy little quote that Heisenberg said, when I meet God, I'm going to ask him two questions: why relativity and why turbulence? And I really believe he'll have an answer for the first of those questions. We're really far away from being able to really understand turbulence at the level we need to, because to really understand it, we have to resolve the scales where it starts, which, for example, the examples that we're most used to would be, look at a big stratocumulus cloud, a big puffy storm cloud, right? It sort of starts at those scales and then roils down to smaller and smaller scales until molecules actually rub up against one another and dissipate the kinetic energy of the roiling into heat. Even at the exascale, we're a long way away from that. But there's still plenty of places where we can make an impact, where maybe you don't have to go quite all the way down to this molecular dissipation scale. You can stop before then and capture a lot of what's going on. And we've already seen people use Frontier for a couple of these examples. So one is weather forecasting. So the ability to resolve the formation and evolution of clouds has actually been a big frontier, again, not to make too much of a pun, for climate modeling for a long time. And we know that clouds impact, of course, they impact directly what our weather and our climate looks like, but indirectly, they also change the rate at which the Earth is heated, the rate at which the oceans are heated, the rate at which things go back into the water cycle, all those things. And so being able to resolve turbulence at terrestrial scales like that is important. Another big project that's been on the machine so far is a project by GE. Turns out that General Electric makes a lot of the world's jet engines. So if you've ever ridden on a plane, the odds are either GE or Rolls-Royce made the engine that powered the plane. And the basic design of both those engines hasn't changed in 50 years. They still are basically the same thing. And if you've ever looked out the window and looked at one while you're on a plane, you know, it has an intake and then it has a shroud around it, right, called a nacelle. And that nacelle is used to sort of direct air into the turbo machinery so you can push it more effectively and get more thrust. Well, it's actually been known for 40 years that it would be better to take the nacelle off of the thing, make the fan a lot bigger on the front, and just push air rather than sort of suck air using the Bernoulli principle. That you would maybe get 30% more fuel efficiency if you did that. Again, it's been known for a long, long time. The problem is, if you do that, jet engines get even louder than they already are, because sound waves get produced at the tips of the fan blades. And you would never be able to have an airport anywhere near anywhere somebody lives. To be able to ameliorate that, you have to be able to do experiments. But the problem is, the way you do experiments on engines is you don't put them on a plane and then fly it, because, well, bad things can happen, right? What you do is you put them in a wind tunnel. It turns out that the biggest wind tunnels in the world can only fit one of these engines at about half scale. So you don't build a real engine, you build a half-size engine. Well, half-size engines don't actually act quite like the full scale does. So the only access that you have is to do a numerical experiment of the full scale of the engine and actually watch what happens to the turbulence at those fan tips that's actually going to induce and make the sound that you want to get rid of. Then you can start playing with the shape of them a little bit and try to knock that sound down. And that's what GE has been doing on the machine. They've been running a single simulation for a few weeks, a few months at this point now, trying to resolve the turbulence coming off one of the fan blades here. Now that, since you guys are my captive audience, I'll also tell you a little bit about a problem that I'm very interested in, that involves turbulence, and that's type 1a supernovae. So type 1a supernovae are these really bright transient events that we see in everywhere in our galaxy and in other galaxies. We know that there's large amounts of radioactive nickel that are produced, and that radioactivity actually powers the light, what's called the light curve of the supernova. It gets bright all of a sudden, and then it fades over time. They don't seem to be associated with star forming regions. There's nothing left. There's no neutron star left behind. There's no black hole left behind. They're just ripped completely apart. And we now know that the likely event is a thermonuclear explosion on a type of star called a white dwarf, which is the kind of star that our own sun will become when it dies. But it doesn't have a binary companion to push it over the edge and make it explode. So we'll be fine. We won't worry about it at that point, because we'll be long gone, because bad things happen before the sun becomes a white dwarf. But one of the scenarios for actually blowing up a white dwarf is to have a small white dwarf that accretes helium from a binary companion. So it basically, through gravity, sucks helium off of a bigger star that's in a binary with, and that lets it go to a place where it does start to detonate. But the detonation, one of the things that can happen is the detonation can actually happen in that surface ocean before things really start to get hairy. And because we were able to do all the physics that we needed to do on GPUs, and then use what's called adaptive mesh refinement to just put resolution where we needed it on the white dwarf, which the white dwarf's about the size of the Earth, to give you a sense of scale. We were able to do some calculations that allowed us to see what the impact of increasing the resolution, the fineness of the grid that we use to study these explosions, what it did to the outcome. And it actually had a profound effect. And you see it here. I'm hoping that I have enough bandwidth to push these at sort of the full rate. On the left is if I have 4 kilometer resolution maximum, and on the right, if I have 2 kilometers, so finer cells. And you can see on the one on the left, what happens is the shock wave, when I light up the helium on the surface, it races around the limb of the star, meets on the other side, and then sort of blows up from that pole. Whereas with finer resolution, it doesn't do that. I have to wait until this sort of shock wave that gets formed and propagates into the star actually focuses at the center. And that's what blows up the star. And that has a pretty pronounced effect on the amount of ejecta, what it looks like, how fast it's going, what it's made of. We can actually see that observationally. We can see the differences between these two things. And so why does it do that? Well, it's turbulent mixing. It's all back to turbulence again. And it turns out that at 4 kilometer resolution, you've turned what should be a well mixed and sort of thing that looks like a really nice lava lamp into something that sort of looks like a PlayStation 1 version of a lava lamp, where you don't have nearly as much resolution and you're doing too much extra mixing. And that's what actually causes that spurious explosion on the surface, is that I'm doing the wrong physics because I don't have enough resolution. So those are all examples of the kind of physics we do, the kind of science that we do. There's tons more, and people are, running huge simulations on the machine even as we speak. So with that, that's all I had, but I'm happy to take a few more questions.
Question on the on your research. So obviously explosion of a star is it's a massive, in our terms, it's massive. In the terms of space overall, it's not that big, but 2 kilometers seems like a much larger data point than what you're talking about with molecules for weather calculations and things like that.
Yep.
How fine-grained do you think like, obviously as fine-grained as you can go is probably the answer to
right.
How fine-grained do you want to go, but how far do you think is enough to
Yep.
truly
That's a great-
understand.
That last question is the operative one. How far do we go? So the other kind of supernovae that we study, we actually go down to sort of like of order 100 meters, so a tenth of that. In some regions of the star, you don't need that resolution everywhere, but you might need it down deep in the star to be able to resolve what you need to. I think that for type 1As, because white dwarfs are they're compact, they're what's called compact objects. And the thing about compact objects is they're fairly uniform. They sort of look the same in all directions because of you've squeezed matter into a state that it doesn't quite know what to do with itself in. And so we may be able to get away with 2-kilometer resolution, but probably it'd be nice to go to sub-kilometer resolution. We probably don't need tens of meters of resolution to be able to actually see what gets produced and to explain the explosion mechanism as well as we want. But yeah, it would be nice to get another factor of 1 or 2 in there.
Cool, thank you.
I have a question.
Mhm.
So I heard that technically, you could like submit a proposal for consideration to be run on not Frontier, but another supercomputer at another laboratory. Is that true?
Absolutely. You can submit a proposal to run on Frontier. Our user program is open to every single person on the planet, period. Now, we do want you to have a good reason to do it, right? Our big allocation programs are open to anybody, and we give lots and lots of time in those. In general, those require multi-page proposals to sort of outline exactly what you're going to do and to show our reviewers that you know what you're doing, that you really need the time, and you won't be able to do the problem you want to do if you don't get it, and that you can make effective use of the machine. Sort of a couple of orders magnitude down from that, we have what's called a director's discretionary program. So I chair a little committee, and that we review these director's discretionary applications every week. We usually tend to give time to folks who are looking to take a code that they have that's maybe CPU only currently, and they want to be able to add GPU capability to it in a straightforward way. We give them, tens of thousands of node hours to be able to work on it in the space of like a year. And our hope is by doing that, we will prepare them to compete in one of these large allocation programs. But yeah, we review 3 or 4 of those proposals every week throughout the year, and you could give out, probably 200,000 node hours of time in a given month via the DD program. So yeah, anybody on the planet can apply for time on Frontier. Tell your friends.
So like if I was gonna search more about that, would I just go to like your website and search?
Director's discretionary. If you go to our website and search director's discretionary allocation, that should do it. I don't know if Katie can find a link, maybe to put in the chat or something like that, but
Yeah, just
yeah.
1 sec.
Okay, and like, is that something that you have to have like an NSF grant to apply for, or?
No, we don't care about the funding. Like I said, all we care about is that you want to use the GPUs, usually to do development. What we don't want to see is somebody who just wants some time to do CPU only code, or they have a third-party code that uses GPUs and they just need twice as much computer time as they can get anywhere else to be able to carry out some problem, right? That's not really congruent with our mission. We want somebody who's actually preparing an application for our large allocation programs and doing the legwork to compete in that. That's really what the program is designed for. But yeah, we don't care at all about the source of funding, or if you have funding at all.
Oh, wow. Thank you.
You mentioned a couple, I'm blanking on the word exactly, but coding frameworks like
Yep.
OpenMP,
Yep.
MPI, Raja. I was just curious, what are the most common ones you see?
Yeah. So that's a great question. So I can tell you that we don't have the census for Frontier yet, but I don't expect it'll be any different. But over the past 2 years, on our other big supercomputer, Summit, which is the number 5 supercomputer in the world, on that machine, to marshal the GPUs, most people use CUDA, which is a proprietary NVIDIA thing. That won't work on NVIDIA. The corresponding thing on NVIDIA, on AMD, is called HIP, but they look a lot alike. The biggest languages are, people use Python to do some things, but Python's not high performance. It's not efficient. If you run a big Python job on Frontier, you might as well go out and kill a kitten, because you're destroying the environment. There's no way around it. I mean, you're wasting heat. A lot of C++, but 61% of all the cycles consumed on Summit for the last 2 years were consumed by Fortran codes. Fortran remains the lingua franca of scientific computing. It is fast. It's easy to compile. It produces code that's blindingly fast. And it has multidimensional arrays as a first-class citizen. And that's what science looks like, right? Well, what is physics? It's vectors and tensors and things like that. And having multidimensional arrays like matrices as first-class citizens in the language really, really helps. I don't see that changing in the next 5 years. I think that it'll remain the dominant language on the machine.
You mentioned that it theoretically has 2 exaflops, but in experiments you found it has more like 1.2 exaflops that you can actually use. Is that just losses due to storage and breaking up instructions, or?
No, that's an excellent question, actually. It's because peak is an almost meaningless number. So the peak rate for any big machine is calculated as if you were reading the memory perfectly, sequentially, every time. You were never jumping around to another part of the memory to get an operand, the number you're going to have to multiply with another number, and that they were always just right beside each other in memory, and you had it in that top layer of cache, and that you never stalled. You never had a decision point to make, that you literally were just doing the same operation over and over with operands that were right there for you to pull out of memory every time over and over and over again. It is such an idealized situation that it's almost not meaningful. But it is a useful sort of number to give you scale and to compare historically to. Right. So it does give you a hint of how fast is this processor plus this memory subsystem versus historical ones. So that's why we keep quoting it, really. No code is going to achieve peak. This LIMPAC code that we run for the benchmark, it's not, we have codes that are a little bit more efficient, but only at sort of the 10% level. So I think we'll probably have some codes that hit 1.3 exaflops or something like that, but that's sort of it. And they tend to be codes that are doing things like electronic structure in solids, where it's sort of the same way any way you look. So there's some codes that can get faster than that, but not a lot faster.
That makes sense.
With the CPUs, you can only have so much cache memory on board. What's the like random access stuff, like what's that situation? You have I don't know. I think I lost my train of thought exactly, but
let me try to reproduce it, reconstruct it a little bit. So yeah, you're right. The way to write good CPU code is to make sure that you have the cache filled with the next thing that you want to compute on, right? So you have it close at hand. So you want to address things and store them in memory in such a way that they're in the right place at the right time, right? And frankly, over the past, say, 10 or 15 years, CPUs got so fast, so quickly, people didn't pay a lot of attention to that, right? Even at the high end, there was some attention paid, but maybe not as much. Well, it turns out that when you move to a GPU, you have to do very much the same sort of operations. You really need to organize the data such that it's really ready to be chomped on, operated on as quickly as possible. And you have it at hand. Because there are things like caches in GPUs. They're not caches, they're register files, but nevertheless, they're like caches. And what we found is when people wrote code for the GPU or took code that used to be on the CPUs and then converted it for use on the GPUs, that then if they just turned off the commands that marshaled the GPU and ran it again back on the CPU, almost always it was 2 times faster on the CPU after they did all that work. It's just that moving to the GPU sort of forced them to pay attention to cache.
Yeah, forced them to optimize, and then it was optimal everywhere.
Correct. And it's amazing how constant that 2 is. Like literally over dozens of codes, it would like be 1.9 in one and 2.1 in the other, but it was never 4 and it was never 1.2. It was always right around 2.
Very cool.
What is the purpose for getting like a new supercomputer for like your?
Why would I want one bigger? Why would I want one bigger, right?
Yeah, like I mean, obviously we always want something bigger and better and new, but like, is it this like fundamental question that somebody or a group of somebody's are asking in their proposals, and you realize that you can't run it?
It's all of those, yeah. I always like to say, when people build computers for like businesses or even for campuses, they'll do what's called requirements gathering, right? They'll go around and they'll ask people, what do you want to compute and how fast does it need to go, right? The users that we have on the leadership computing facilities, I like to say they never do what they want, they do what they can. I have aspirations to do computations that Frontier's got no chance of being able to do. And most of our really big users are doing things that are rife with approximations they would like to get rid of, that are at resolutions, as we discussed earlier, that are not nearly as high as they would like to go to be able to make sure that they don't need to go there again. And that don't include physical phenomena that they know need to be included. And that's even at the exascale. So as long as there's that set of questions like that, we're going to try to build bigger computers. We've been thinking about the next big computer after Frontier already. And so, yeah, we're gearing up to build it. We actually just released a draft version of the request for proposals from vendors for it, literally this week. So, yeah.
I have to follow that up with, are you excited to see how El Capitan pans out over in Livermore?
That's a good question. Yeah, we're of course watching that. We actually built Frontier in concert with them. We had one RFP, and vendors answered the one RFP and said, and then we picked one architecture and Livermore picked the other one. And we used the same contract template to do both. So we actually did it in collaboration with them. And they were able to go after us. We needed to have a new computer first. So we got what we got, and they got to wait for another generation with the MI300s. All right, guys. Thanks very much. And this has been great. And if you have any more questions, feel free to ask them through email or something like that. All right.
Thank you, Professor, for hosting this.
All right. Thanks a lot, guys.
Thanks.
Yeah,
I'll
thanks.
send the
Bye-bye.
recording shortly. Thanks,
All right.
Bronson.
Bye-bye.
Bye, guys.